political analyst, commentator Tessa Durms, who has been speaking, especially in the last 24 hours or so, Tessa, about the response by government to the initial emergency. How do you rate the way in which the presiding officers and the Public Works Minister have handled this, especially as far as communication to the public is concerned?
Thank you, Tembi. So I think we have to start by saying, in fairness, this is a unique set of circumstances for anybody in government to be dealing with. A fire is something that when it starts and the way in which it evolves can really be erratic, and the crisis can change in many different ways. But I do think that there have been a few issues that have come up between now and when the fire started that raise serious concerns about how Parliament has been managed and how government's public infrastructure is being managed. We've heard, of course, concerns around reports that have been done and around security issues around the last fire last year that many parliamentarians say they have not had sight of. And so you think about the kind of preventative measures and recommendations that may sit in those reports that may or may not have contributed to allaying what has happened today from happening. But I think even more pressingly are the serious questions that we have to get answers to around whether or not there were staffing issues that have been raised by Nahau. We haven't gotten a very clear answer from either the Speaker of Parliament or anybody else around whether that claim has any validity or legitimacy to it. And we know that if that is true, that really does say something about our national key points in general and whether or not we have a safeguard around them. And particularly when it comes to an institution like Parliament, where many people can access it because of the way it's located, you would think that security would be a very big deal and that no amount of money would be spared. Because as we've seen in this instance, if it is the case that we were sparing money in terms of salaries, the cost that we're going to see incurred, I think, in trying to either renovate this building or even just, getting through clearing up of this building and deciding what happens next are going to go into the millions, and that comes out of the fiscus. And I think the final thing that just stands as a highlight in the last 24 hours or so is that there is this issue about somebody who, by the accounts of the President and the Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure, has been arrested by the police and now by the Hawks. And we have to have clear answers about that. I think it's very dangerous for people to, especially government officials, high-ranking ones, to report on things like somebody being arrested or charges that are pending without us having a much clearer understanding of what the context is for that. So it's easy to say to the public, don't speculate, but when you give people half information or you give them tidbits here and there without any clarity or any line of sight to when clarity will be given, of course, then speculation becomes rife, and that leads to misinformation and disinformation, which is never good in a situation like this.
And on the issue of Nahau and what they were raising as far as the suspension, shall we call it, of security personnel services on the weekend shift, especially on weekends, the National Assembly Speaker, Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula, said she rang the Parliament Secretary yesterday to ask her about this, and the response she got was that no such directive, no such instruction was given. But if no such instruction was given and there was adequate security, or at least by number, it is still damning that even when, let's say, you do have a decent or sufficient staff complement, someone is still able to evade all of those people and make it into a building and cause such damage as is being alleged that he did it. Absolutely.
And there are also questions about if no such directive was given, what do we make of Nahau's claims? Because Nahau's claim isn't simply a vague claim that staff weren't expected to be at work. It's a very specific claim about resourcing issues in December, during weekends, and those kinds of things. And I think we deserve a much more detailed answer rather than no such directive was given by a particular person, the Secretary in Parliament, because there may have been directives given by other people. That being said, the point that you raise is even more important, is that if we did have a full staff complement, How was this allowed to happen? And does that mean that on any given day this could have happened in the past and that other national security sites may be suffering the same kind of vulnerabilities? I mean, one of the things that was raised in the last 24 hours, and particularly at the press conference today by the minister particularly, was this question about the cameras. And the speaker is very adamant that the cameras were working in Parliament. And then the minister follows up by saying that nobody was manning those cameras and watching those cameras from time to time. So that really says that there are breaches here in management, in security, in the ways in which this national security, this national key point had been secured. And those things are going to be raised once we find out more about the details of the person who at this point has said to have climbed into the back window of Parliament. I mean, that has come from a parliamentary spokesperson. We have to get better information about this, but it does raise serious concerns about the security at Parliament, the security at national key points, and what we know about staff and the competence or complement of staff that has been available.
And what you're raising, Tessa, the many unanswered questions, then feed into the very speculation that the presiding officers have been urging the public to avoid.
And certainly, I mean, I think it goes without saying that it's never a good idea for people to speculate about something like arson. In this case, when we're talking about really the House of the People, Parliament is our key institution in terms of people's democracy and participation being given full effect. And so if we have had an intentional attack, which is what arson would effectively be, on that house, then there's definitely a bigger crisis than just this one. And I think it's important that we have a timeline given to us by the minister, by the speaker, around when we can start expecting information that fill up the gaps so that we don't continue to see more and more speculation. We need to know when we'll get a security report from in Parliament and from the city of Cape Town around the fire and what might have started it. We definitely need to be looking out tomorrow for when the person who is said to be arrested will appear in court, because that information should be available and be public once that person is in court. But we need a clear line of sight and a clear understanding of the timeline to when we will get some of these gaps in information filled up. It really is unacceptable to just say that we should not speculate when we are being given tidbits of information that cause speculation on something this important.
And it doesn't help, Tessa, doesn't it, that all of this is happening in the context of a country where something is seriously broken. In July, we saw the unrest that swept through KZN and Gauteng. There's been little to no accountability for some of what happened. Atrocities committed in some extent, where over 300 people lie dead as you and I speak today in this new year. We had a fire at the Charlotte Maxeke Hospital that gutted a section of that hospital. Currently, people are unable to access oncology services. These are cancer patients who are standing at death's door in some cases when you hear the families speak to various media. And people are again saying, well, we don't believe what is being given as the official explanation from government and other authorities, because there isn't a track record of truthful and incredibly honest accountability in the true sense. How do you make sense of that feeling among the population?
I mean, the trust deficit in government's communication is very, very, very high. People don't trust what government says. As a general rule in this country now, for at least the last few years, given COVID, given some of the complications that have happened around corruption and information and misinformation that's gone around there, July riots certainly have not put people at ease in terms of government's ability to not only give truthful information, but even to speak from the same hymn book. I mean, it's ironic that the person who is now the Speaker of Parliament dealing with this crisis, at the head of this crisis, was reshuffled very shortly after as Minister of Defense. She took a very different line to the President and the Presidency when it came to what the cause of the July riots were. I mean, here we have a potential of a security cluster problem in one of two ways. Either there was adequate security and there were adequate resources and we had adequate information and somebody was able to just walk in off the street and go into Parliament and cause damage that we aren't even sure how much damage it is. Or there's an even bigger crisis where there is again a national security issue, which would then include state security, and that's, I think, the reason why we saw Deputy Minister Zizi Kodwa on the scene yesterday, in case of that eventuality, because then the question about whether our intelligence services, which, by the way, after the July riots, has been moved into the office of the presidency, would be able to know if there was some kind of threat, if there's an intentional threat on something like Parliament. So there's so many questions that speak to our competencies as a country when it comes to our national security, when it comes to our communication about these issues, and when it comes to our ability to avert such major crises. We've had too many crises in a short period of time that have not been followed up with clear communication, clear strategies, and clear ways forward.
That then brings me to the next question, the issue of the State of the Nation address. There was a lot of focus, which I know you were critical of yesterday, as a focus on the State of the Nation address and the fact that it will go ahead. The date that we know that's out there currently is the 10th of February. But when President Cyril Ramaphosa does speak next month, how should he sum up the events of the past year, including what we're dealing with today, such a serious breach of security?
I mean, it would be disingenuous for me to answer that question without saying that I don't think the State of the Nation address needs to go ahead as planned. I think that it was almost strange to me that one of the first things that the Speaker said to us yesterday, and again, one of the things that was reiterated quite strongly as the purpose of the press briefing today, was the idea that SONA would continue. I think as a country, we need to remember that SONA is a, by and large, ceremonial thing that happens in Parliament. The President calls that sitting of the House in order to start Parliament in a ceremonial fashion. But there is no concrete debates that need to happen, that need to be voted on, or something that will happen as a consequence of SONA. And so we should not fixate on things that are not priorities. I would think that a greater priority in the work of Parliament, given what the circumstances are now, particularly now knowing that the National Assembly chambers are gutted, is where do we hold the budget vote, which is a much more important set of events in the calendar of the year, where we have a budget that needs to be tabled, we need it to be debated, we need it to be passed. And that is a critical function of government, and it would be a big problem in our system if we didn't have that happen. So we need to be thinking about the day-to-day functions of Parliament and the way that they'll affect governance, rather than thinking about SONA and a ceremonial thing. Because I think that there are two things at play here. One is, what should the president be saying at a time like this? If he was going to say it at SONA, he should probably say it right now, because now is the time when the eyes of the country is looking at a particular point, and they're looking at Parliament, and they're looking at an institution in flames. And you would want your president to, if he's going to say something, to step in and say it right now and not wait for a ceremonial occasion. But more importantly, we need answers like what we started getting in that press briefing about whether or not there are alternatives for where parliamentary offices can be relocated to. So we're talking about potentially the City of Cape Town Hall. We're talking about things like the ICC. Those are the kinds of conversations that are really important. We need to talk about the ability and capacity of Parliament to go virtual, especially not just only with its MPs. I think the MPs have been virtual in many ways, but it's the actual staff who go to the building every day that we need to have conversations about, and how their lives and their functions will be affected. Those conversations are much more critical at this point than a ceremonial address by the president.
And just as a final question, Tessa, you mentioned the issue of money, and as has become South African tradition, and we are an increasingly skeptical population, people have said, now what we need to go into watch in the aftermath of this is how the money for repairs and renovations is going to be spent, and whom is going to benefit.
Yes, and I think that this shows something about our society, that the last 10 to 15 years of this country has really awoken our sense of civic responsibility when it comes to looking at the ways money is spent in this country and tracking for corruption at every turn. And I think that's a healthy thing and something that should continue well into the future, regardless of who's in government. We must pay attention to how money is spent, what it is allocated for, and importantly, whether things are done in the correct way and yield the right fruit. In this case, I think that we are going to have some constraints around the fact that, and I think Minister De Lille has said this a few times, that this is a national heritage site. And so there will be a lot of constraints around what can happen and the time frames in which it can happen. We are told that what happened in March last year, the fire then, that repairs to that have not actually been completed because there are more players than just Parliament in terms of how things get reconstructed. But of course, the EFF have raised the debate about whether or not this should just be reconstructed into a museum, and we should think about picking up a debate that has been held in Parliament and in government a few times over around potentially moving Parliament to the Gauteng area. I mean, there's feasibility studies that have been done around that, so we need to look at whether there's a cost-benefit analysis around those kinds of issues as well. But either way, whether we decide that as a country we need to move Parliament or not, that building does need to have some kind of heritage reconstruction at minimum, and we need to know how much that's going to cost us as a country, and we certainly need to track the finances and the funds around that with the kind of diligence we do with any other kind of thing, because at this point, money that could have been spent on water, sanitation, housing is now going to be spent here, and we need to know that that's going to be a trade-off worth having.
Okay. Tessa Durms, political analyst and commentator, speaking to us about the political ramifications, shall we call it, of the devastating fire at the Houses of Parliament since yesterday, a flare-up for those of you just joining us in the last 2 hours or so, just after 4 o'clock.